Well, Mr. Pozner, Vladimir, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you.
And affording me this opportunity. I really appreciate it. Americans have a lot of misconceptions about Russia, especially the government and the media present an overly simplistic and an unfavorable view of Russia. Not that this is anything new, but this is the contemporary scene. What is it that the U.S. government and the U.S. media just get wrong?
That's a very difficult question to answer, actually, because what I would ask is perhaps not only what do they get wrong, but what do they deliberately say that is not true?
Okay.
And that's a combination of things. It's one thing not to understand another country. For instance, I was in Japan, and it took me a very long time to begin to understand things because the Japanese do things very differently, not good or bad, different. It's another thing to have a prejudice about another people or another country and to present things in a negative light. Now, the relationship between, broadly, I'll call it Russia and the United States has been a difficult one for most of the 20th century because of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that was very threatening to the United States in the sense of to capitalism, the goal of having a world revolution and of having socialism everywhere. And this initiated things like the Red Scare in the United States back in the 1920s. And these things evolved over the years, all the way up to the post-war period when you had Joe McCarthy and all of those things. So there was a deep ideological difference and between the USSR and the United States. And that pretty much, in my opinion at least, fomented the way people looked at quote-unquote Russia, because USSR, Russia, to most Americans was exactly the same thing. Although, of course, USSR consisted of a lot of other countries that were not Russian at all, like Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, what have you. So that's one side of it. The negative attitude over a 70-plus year period became part of the American outlook. Then things changed. Suddenly, the USSR became a different country. Gorbachev, glasnost, perestroika, we're going to be friends, great. Everyone was overjoyed on both sides of the fence. The American side basically saying, oh, now they're going to be like us, finally.
Right.
That was the average view. The view at the top was Russia had better behave now and do what we tell them to do. They lost the Cold War.
Right.
They're no longer a superpower. And so they just better do what we tell them and shut up. And that attitude, which wasn't evident immediately, gradually became more and more evident and really broke out with the bombing of Yugoslavia in the late 90s,
right,
when Yeltsin, who was supposedly a great friend of America, said, no, this we will not stand for. And the problem from that point on, actually, was that Russia was no longer willing to follow the American lead. And this led to tremendous anger on the part of the American establishment, which was reflected in statements and in media.
I got it.
And of course, when Putin came around, who initially wanted to be a member of the West, I mean, he officially proposed that Russia join NATO and that Russia become part of the European Union. And he was officially told in much more politer terms, but to go do whatever. And in fact, he was told that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO well before Russia. This is official. This isn't something that, I'm dreaming up. And ultimately, in 2007, in Munich, Putin made his famous speech saying that we no longer agree to being treated like a second-rate nation. We have our global aspirations and interests, and we are going to protect them. And from that point on, Putin became monster number one, and Russia became a negative. Mm-hmm. So it's not so much that there are misconceptions. It's that there are certain views that have been repeated time and time again in media. And after all, where do people get their information about another country? Mm-hmm. Basically, television, newspapers.
Right.
And if you take a good hard look at U.S. media over the past, I would say, at least 12 years, and try to find anything positive about Russia, and I mean anything, like there are good restaurants in Moscow, for example,
right,
you're going to have a real problem.
Yeah, I understand that completely.
So it's not surprising that your average American, and even not so average American, has a very negative view of Russia. When I go to America and I say I have a show on Channel 1, they buy it, in which I have criticized Putin more than once and said that I don't agree with some of his policies, and they say, "You mean you're still alive?"
Right.
They have this view of today's Russia being the Soviet Union under Stalin.
Right.
When people were shot, put in the gulag, and God knows what. That is the kind of image that gradually has been reinstated in the United States.
Stuck in time. Right. You've had, as a really esteemed journalist in both countries, a unique perspective, of an inside view on the intricacies of the relationship, its unique dynamics that hardly anybody else, very few people have had. Okay? Since just the Cold War, how have U.S. and Russian relations changed?
Since the end of the Cold War?
Yes, since the end of the Cold War. How do you see that in synopsis? I mean, what are the major points of those changes?
Well, the major points, in my opinion, of course, and everything I say is in my opinion, I'm not going to repeat that. Let's say that the Cold War ended with the bringing down of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I would say that was pretty much the end.
I agree.
Okay? Certain agreements were made. There was a certain understanding that was reached. Well, for instance, Secretary of State James Baker told Mikhail Gorbachev that if he allowed the taking down of the Berlin Wall, he, Baker, could promise that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. That was not written on paper, but it was written down by secretaries who were listening to this conversation, and you can find that. It's not like, again, someone's imagination. So that was one very important thing for then the Soviet Union, because no matter what you say, but for the Soviet Union, NATO was an aggressive bloc, not a defensive one. Soviet Union saw NATO as an aggressive military force. So the fact that it would not move eastward was extremely important for the feeling of safety on the part of the Soviet leadership. That was one thing. The second thing was that your average Russian felt that now we could be friends. Arms spread wide open because, hey, we're the ones, we took down communism, not you guys. We in our own country, we did it. Mm-hmm. We've changed the system. So, aren't we buddies now? Aren't you going to like us?
Oh, wow.
When that didn't happen,
right.
In Russia proper, there gradually grew a kind of resentment. Why aren't we being treated like everyone else? What is it? Why has NATO moved in our direction? Against who is NATO then moving? Are we still considered the enemy? What's going on here? So what we've seen, how I would describe it, is a gradual downhill movement from the apex of the Berlin Wall comes down, we're friends, we're going to work together. And from that, gradually, the graph, as you will, going down, 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 and down, with hardly any positive movement at all. Hardly anything was achieved, realistically.
Right.
Certain things were preserved for a certain amount of time, and then they were taken apart. And now, with the Trump administration, some extremely important arms agreements have been pretty much cast aside. And as I've said before, I'm not a big fan of President Putin's, but I have to say that given the possibility, Putin would have worked to have a close relationship with the West. He was told in no uncertain terms that there was no interest in that. And the reaction is as follows. And about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I was invited to lecture at Yale. And the title of my lecture was How the United States Created Vladimir Putin.
It's a great lecture. I enjoyed that a lot.
But it's true. That's what happened.
Right.
So that's really the tragedy of it.
Right.
Because working together, the United States of America and Russia, having their own interests, but still working together, could achieve phenomenal things, both in the area of fighting climate change, as well as in the area of putting a certain important amount of opposition to China. In fact, there's very, very little those two countries together could not do.
Right.
So, as I see it, it's really a tragedy that because of this, what I call the doctrine that was formulated by a very well-known American politician back in 1992, the Wolfowitz doctrine, where he basically said that we are now the only superpower. We have to stay that way. We have to see to it that other countries do not challenge us, including Western European countries, and we have to keep Russia down. That was one way of looking at it. And the other way of looking at it was to say, look, we have a window of opportunity here. We can evolve a kind of Marshall Plan, as we did after World War II. We can not just give Russia money, but direct it in a certain way to see to it that democratic institutions develop in a country that had none whatsoever. We can help that country become a democracy. And here are your choices. And ultimately, the choice was made by President Clinton, who decided to enlarge NATO with Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. And that was the first signal that we're not going to go the way of a Marshall Plan. We're going to go in a different direction. And so, with all due respect, I find it very hard to blame Russia for any of this. And if we're going to speak about Ukraine and Crimea,
we come into my next question at this point. Because my next question is to this point of the expansion of NATO. And it's a several-part question, but I believe you'll answer it as you will. After the Cold War ended, NATO continued to expand.
Not immediately.
Not immediately.
No.
But nonetheless,
it did.
Inexorably, I think is the best word.
I agree with
Not inevitably, inexorably, because that carries more purpose with it. And greater tensions arose between Russia and the United States, as you have iterated directly. How has U.S. foreign policy, both in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, impacted relations between the two countries? And specifically, how do Crimea and a concept I think that is utterly foreign to Americans, the idea of a Russian near abroad, the orphaned ethnic Russians in other countries, which you find utterly no mention of in American media. How do Crimea and the near abroad factor in? And do you think we are in or headed towards another Cold War?
Well, I think we already are in a certain kind of Cold War.
Okay.
But let me back off here a little bit.
Okay.
What Americans don't, one of the things people often say about Putin is he called the collapse, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, a huge catastrophe and so on. Not the exact words, but something like that. And immediately it was said that, he wants to go back to the Soviet Union. See, he says that the disappearance of the Soviet Union was a terrible calamity, what have you. What he was referring to was the fact that 25 million.
That many?
Yes. Ethnic Russians found themselves living in foreign countries. So they were found in the Baltic states, in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, what have you. 25 million Russians found themselves in foreign countries. Not only that, but their families were separated because some were living in Russia proper, and they were living in one of the Russian republics or the Soviet republics, and now this was all gone. It was a tremendous shock. And in that sense, it was a global catastrophe for them. 25 million of these people. And do you just forget about them? Do you just say, well, too bad, Or do you try to do something to make their lives somehow more comfortable, or at least to protect them in some way? That's a general kind of view. Now, when we talk about Ukraine, Crimea, what have you, I'm going to have to remind you about 1962. In 1962, Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev agreed to deploy Soviet missiles on Cuban soil. Now, they were two independent gentlemen representing their countries, and they had the full right to make that agreement. Absolutely. International law, whatever. Okay. However, when the United States discovered that this was going on, President Kennedy made it very clear that either the Russians would turn their ships around and sail back and pull out whatever they'd already installed, or their ships would be attacked by the United States. And if World War III was the result, then so be it. And we were on the very brink of World War III. Mm-hmm. Thank heavens the two men had the intelligence not to push it. The Russians pulled out their missiles, and so did the Americans, who had missiles in Turkey. Of course, they didn't make a lot of noise about that, and most Americans don't even know that was the case because it was a loss of face.
Right.
But they pulled out their... Okay, now, what I'm saying is President Kennedy infringed on international law. These two countries had the right to agree to place their missiles wherever they wanted on their own soil. But yet the President of the United States said, no, we won't allow it. Why? Because he saw this as being an existential threat to the United States. Mm-hmm. And when a country or its leadership sees an existential threat, it will do what it needs to protect itself regardless of international law.
Correct.
Okay, now we come back to this situation. Here's Ukraine. Ukraine has a very large border on Russia, on the southwestern part of Russia. Crimea, part of Ukraine, has the city of Sevastopol, which is the naval base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Now, imagine for a moment that Ukraine becomes a member of NATO. Very realistically, that means that you're going to have NATO forces on Russia's border in the southwest. Mm-hmm. And instead of having the Russian Navy in Sevastopol, you'll have the American Sixth Fleet. For Russian leadership, I'm not arguing correctly or incorrectly, but nonetheless, for them, that was seen as an existential threat. And Putin said, we will not allow it.
Right.
Was he infringing on international law? Yes, he was. But it's the same kind of reasoning. We will not allow Ukraine to become a member of NATO. And if we have to put our soldiers there, we will. And we will not allow Sevastopol to become a base for any Western fleet, especially the U.S.
Right.
That is basically what happened. Now, let alone the fact that the vast majority of people in Crimea wanted to be part of Russia, historically it's part of Russia. I'm not even going to argue about that. That's a whole different story. And there's always, what do you do when the majority of the people, like the people of Kosovo, didn't want to be members of Yugoslavia? And with the help of NATO, they became quote unquote independent. That seemed to be okay, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go into that part of it, although one could. But the basic story here is an existential threat to the security of a country. That's what the whole Ukrainian and Crimean issues are about.
I got it.
And it's very simple, really.
Yeah.
It's not. And if you put up a map, I've done this with Americans. You put up a map of the United States and Mexico, okay? Now, you see the border, right? And you say, let's imagine that tomorrow there's a revolution in Mexico. That's possible to imagine. Mm-hmm. And that the people who come to power are not friends of the United States of America. That's also possible, right? Mm-hmm. And just imagine for a minute, ladies and gentlemen, that they, fearing that Big Brother, is a bit threatening to them, invite 10 Russian military divisions to protect their border. You think the United States will allow that?
Right.
So give this some thought. That's what I always say.
Never going to happen.
No, of course not.
Okay. In 2016, then candidate Trump said, wouldn't it be great if the U.S. and Russia could just get along?
Right.
Okay? Mm-hmm. And he seemed genuinely interested in ending the antagonistic relationship his predecessors had. Right. I mean...
Yes.
Hillary and Kerry and et cetera, Obama.
Right.
Okay. It's a multi-part question, but I'll give you the questions that embrace the concept. What is your take on why there's been no meaningful policy change towards Russia? Are sanctions the main issue? Do you see these as a Russian, as an act of war? Mm-hmm. And if they were done away with, just how would relations then be between the two countries?
Question number one about what Trump said during the presidential campaign. Certainly that was appreciated in Russia because his opponent, Hillary Clinton, compared Putin to Hitler. So when one candidate says, your president is Hitler, and the other said it would be good to have better relations,
right.
Obviously your choice is going to be right now. Of course, one of the things that was used immediately afterwards, when, to everyone's surprise, Hillary lost, was that Trump had won because the Russians had somehow infiltrated the system and interfered in the elections and so on and so forth. Of course, that was a big feather in the Russians' cap. Imagine how extremely powerful and influential Russian propaganda is to get a guy from Kansas or Iowa to vote for Trump instead of Hillary Clinton. I mean, let's not exaggerate this.
And using so little money.
No money whatsoever,
right.
And who are the Americans to complain when you consider how much the United States has interfered in elections all over the world, including by use of military force?
Right.
Well, we're not going to talk about that. So, however, this whole story obviously made it pretty impossible for Trump to do anything pro-Russian, because immediately it would be, see? He's in collusion. He is doing this.
Right.
The whole story with Mueller and all of that. Finally, Mueller coming out saying that they found no collusion. But how long did it take? It took 2 years. And even so, there's still talk about that. So with whatever he might have desired, and I think he honestly would have preferred to have normal relations with Russia. Not that he's, madly in love or anything, but it would be, better for the United States and for the rest of the world. Obviously, he couldn't do it with the situation he had. That's point number one. Point number two, let me see, what was it that you asked me then?
Sanctions, acts of war.
So the sanctions that were introduced, have they hurt? Yes, they have. Is it an act of war? No, it's not. They've hurt economically. In Russia, people's standard of living has gone down, in part because of that. Real wages have fallen, in part because of that. Russia cannot get credit from foreign banks because of that, and without that credit, Russia cannot buy the kind of modern machinery it needs to modernize its own industries. So yes, it's hurt. Has it had a positive effect? Yes, it has. Russia's agriculture is now booming, precisely because nothing could be imported. Today, Russia's agriculture is number 2 in funds that it brings into Russia after gas and oil.
I know, that's amazing.
More than arms. More than arms.
Right.
Number 2. So now the farmers in this country say, please keep the sanctions. Please keep the sanctions, because they're doing great with all of that. So in a sense, and also the sanctions have given Russians more of a sense of independence. See, we can do it. We can do it. We can take it. And Russians are pretty good at living in hard times. They're much worse at living in good times than in bad times.
Right.
They're very tough. So that's the second point. So if tomorrow the sanctions were removed, there'd have to be a reason. And if the reason were, look, the sanctions are counterproductive. The world has become a too dangerous place. There is no trust. The danger of a nuclear mistake are very great. Let's try to sit down and find ways to cooperate. Well, I think the initial reaction would be, can we trust them? Or is this another one of those ploys? But by and large, of course, the vast majority of people would be overjoyed.
Right.
And again, it would be good not only for Russia, let alone all the West European countries who cannot export to Russia and who would really want to.
Right.
So it would be a yes for everybody, should it happen.
Good. Thank you. Do you see at this time a resurging Russia as a restoration of Russian empire or a national state resurgence? And then I want to talk a little bit about Russia vis-a-vis the Middle East and Iran and the kingdom.
Yeah, well, look, certainly not. Russia is not a resurgent empire. There's no way it's ever going to be an empire again. And empires have this universal feature of disappearing forever, whether it's ancient Rome or whether it's the UK or whether whatever. Once it's gone, it's gone. It's not going to come back. And people have to come to terms with that. Russia has been an empire since the days of Peter the Great. We're talking about the 18th century. It is used to being an empire. The Soviet Union was an empire. The loss of empire is painful. It's like, when you lose a leg, but you have phantom pains. The leg isn't there, but it still hurts. Well, that's what's going on. Right. Psychologically, it's difficult to accept. So you have a certain degree of nationalism, chauvinism. You have that.
Right.
And it's part of growing out of what you were once upon a time and becoming something else. Is that happening in Russia? It's happening. Is it painful? Yes, it's painful. Is there a deep divide between the older generation and the younger generation? There's always a divide, but in this case, a very deep divide. Yes, there is. Because the older generation is a Soviet generation that was brought up in the Soviet Union, that went to Soviet schools, that was created by a society that no longer exists. The younger generation grew up in a different kind of place. It could travel, it has the internet, it can watch whatever movies, read whatever books, whatever newspapers, whatever it wants. It is independent in the way it thinks, as differing from the older generation. So there's a real divide between the two. And it's not until the people who are in power today, Soviets, are gone, and those who today are 18, 19, 20 come to power, that the real changes will begin to occur in this country.
Interesting.
So that's the way, of course, that's the way I see it. Is there today a resurgence? No, there's this change going on.
It's a gradual change.
It's a very difficult one. A very difficult one. But nonetheless, it's happening. I can see it. I travel a lot around Russia. And when I speak, the places are packed. And most of the people, much to my surprise and gratification, are under 30. And, you know, I'm not a young man, to put it bluntly. And yet there are these about 80% young people. And when I've asked myself, well, why is it? You know, what do I say that attracts them? And basically what I think it is simply they see that I'm true, that I say the truth. I tell the truth. I don't lie. I don't beat around the bush. And I ask questions to make them think, not to accept. I always say, don't accept what you're told. Think about it. Doubt it. And, you know, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So another question. How do Russia's actions in the Middle East, which is actually, this is a question we came up with about a month ago, but it's particularly apt after what occurred yesterday, reflect this change in...
What occurred yesterday, you mean what?
The decision by the Russians not to accommodate OPEC Plus in cutting back production.
Yes.
That the whole relationship with MBS had theoretically put in place, but which I see as not the case. How do Russia's actions in the Middle East reflect this, for instance, in Syria, or the pulling out of American forces, troops from the Middle East? And how do you see Russia vis-a-vis Iran, the kingdom, and the decline concomitantly with Pax Americana, if that is indeed
well, here's
coincidence?
For me, the problem is this. All right, you have a country called Iraq or Syria. You have local people living there. What goes on in that country, in my opinion, is strictly their business.
Right.
Excuse me, I have a phone call. Алло? Да. Да, все правильно. Да. Угу. Да, мне все равно. Да. Хорошо есть. So, it would be a good thing if no other country felt the need to interfere in the business of another country. Mm-hmm. However, that's not the case. We have what are so-called global interests. So the Soviet Union had its global interests, and it had a lot of influence in the Middle East and around that area, which is much closer to it than the United States. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union disappeared, it was a kind of a vacuum. The United States immediately moved into that area because it had its interests. And then when Russia started coming back, Putin came back in Syria, case in point. First, the Americans went in supporting the opposition to Assad, and then the Russians came in supporting Assad. So what you have is, again, you have these two countries, plus, of course, China, in a different way, trying to further what they consider to be their global interests at the cost of local people. Right. No, but they never asked them to come in to begin with. So I would put it this way. I totally disagree with the foreign policy of Russia in that respect, as well as with the foreign policy of the United States. My view would be, keep out. It's none of your goddamn business. It's their country. And the only reason you go in is because you're stronger than they are. Mm-hmm. Because if you weren't, you wouldn't be going in. You don't go into China, for instance, because you don't like the system. And you don't even go into North Korea, for a very good reason, because you're afraid you'll get a bomb on your capital or something. So this whole idea of global interests, to me, is a profoundly provocative and dangerous idea, that can even lead to serious military conflict.
Right.
Okay, the United States is finally getting out of Afghanistan. Well, the only reason it's getting out of Afghanistan is because it didn't succeed in doing anything there. Not really. The Taliban are back.
Right.
The Russians fought there for a while and also had to get out. Isn't that a lesson? Isn't that enough? I mean, how many times does this have to happen before you understand that, well, we may not like what's going on in that country, but it's just none of our business. Now, there can be very specific, rare cases when the United Nations might say we must interfere. That's what it exists, like some kind of genocide. Mm-hmm. But then it has to be a decision of the United Nations, not of the United States or of the Russian Federation or of the Chinese People's Republic.
Right.
It has to be that's what the United Nations was created for. Now, if the United Nations all together unanimously says, yes, we must interfere, that's legitimate. And that's the only legitimate. Otherwise, there should be no such things as global interests.
Okay, good. All right. Business climate in Moscow.
Yeah.
Is corruption still a major problem?
Yes.
We already covered sanctions. Are the days of oligarchy indeed in the past?
Yeah, the days of oligarchy are in the past. Well, if we keep in mind what the word oligarch means, it's an ancient Greek word, mm-hmm. and it means someone who has not only a lot of money but a lot of political power. The two go together. So the real oligarch is the one who's calling the shots besides having all the money, and the two go hand in hand. Now, in the Soviet Union, in the late Soviet Union, and then in Russia afterwards, a group of people did appear, oligarchs, who in fact began to run the country.
Berezovsky,
and others. There were a lot of other, yeah, and ultimately, what Putin did in 2000, I think it was 2003, if I'm not mistaken, when he was in his third year of presidency, he called them in, had a big meeting, and he said, look, we know how you made your money, and we're not going to talk about that, but, we know how it's not all honestly, but okay. And you can keep on making it, but there's one condition. Get out of politics. Now, your children can become politicians, but you get out of politics. And they all said, okay, with the exception of Khodorkovsky, right, who said okay, but decided to keep on doing what he was doing, and that's, what happened to him. Today, there are no oligarchs. There are wealthy people. They don't call the shots. In that sense, there's no oligarchy. Mm-hmm. Is there corruption? There's huge corruption. Huge corruption. At the very top. And as the Russians say, the fish rots from the head. So you have to look there before you start looking down. Because if a cop on the street will take a few rubles so as not to give you a fine, that's one thing. But you're not talking about that. You're talking about people at the very top, the governors and others, who will take huge amounts of money for different favors. That's a very serious problem. It affects the economy. It affects the morale. Because people say, hey, what am I supposed to do? You're telling me I shouldn't do this, but look, the guy up there, he's doing it. And when I go see him and ask him for something, he says, so what am I supposed to do?
Right.
And until really serious efforts are made to fight corruption at the top level, you're going to have the problem there's always corruption. In every country there's corruption, right, including the United States. Big time. However, there's a limit to how much corruption. In Russia today, it's pretty pervasive. I mean, most Russians say corruption, big deal. It's life. Mm-hmm. It's life. It's part of the structure, or should I say, part of the fabric of life. You've got to change people's outlooks, and the only way you can change people's outlooks is by changing the behavior of those they look up to. If I'm a father and I smoke, I can't tell my kid you shouldn't smoke.
Right.
It just makes no sense. So you're smoking, why can't I? It's the same kind of thing.
I got it. Okay, good. President Putin took a move to change the constitution of Russia.
Yes.
In some significant fashions.
Yes.
And called for the government to resign and reconstitute itself. How do you see that, as well as the consequences of that regarding the secession to Putin? President Putin.
Let's start with the government. Putin, and not only Putin, was clearly not happy with the performance of the government.
Okay.
Clearly not happy. And when he made a suggestion that there should be change, the government resigned very quickly, and a new government was appointed. This new government is far more functional, down to earth, and the prime minister, Mr. Mishustin, was given pretty much a green light to select whoever he wanted as members of government, not Putin. Putin said, all right, it's your baby, you select them. And I think that was a very good thing, and we'll see whether there will be positive results. The changing of the Constitution is an interesting thing. You know that the United States Constitution has had 27 amendments.
Mm-hmm.
That's over 200 years. The first 10 were adopted immediately, called the Bill of Rights. All the others, the 17 others, it took over 200 years for them to be adopted.
Right.
Okay. So the American Constitution, the United States Constitution, has something very permanent about it. And the things that it declares are not things that you change today, tomorrow, and the day after. They're very basic. And to have an amendment, you have to have all 50 states vote on that. 2/3 of the state have to vote for it.
Right.
You have 7 years to make that happen. It is a very serious process.
Oh, yeah, that's right. The Equal Rights Amendment is...
Now, suddenly in Russia, boom, like this, President Putin says times have changed, we need to change the Constitution. These are amendments. These are amendments. I think there are about 15 of them. Some seem to me good. For instance, the amendment that no one can be president for more than 2 terms, period, because it used to say for 2 terms in a row.
Mm-hmm.
So you could be for 2 terms, then, let someone else be and then come back, as President Putin did with Medvedev. So, but the real question there are several questions you want to ask yourself. Why do we need these changes? What has changed to make it necessary? What do these amendments actually say? Point number 3. You are asking the population to vote, a referendum. And yet you know damn well that the vast majority of the population don't give a tinker's damn about the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly or not, but in Russia, most people don't care about the Constitution because it's never been an important thing. The Stalin Constitution was very progressive, didn't stop the Gulag or people being killed and so on. So the attitude towards the Constitution is kind of like, who cares? So you're not really going to have any serious discussion about the Constitution, about the amendments. And come April 22nd, which, by the way, is Lenin's birthday, people are going to vote yes or no. And, of course, the overwhelming majority is going to vote yes. And it's a given. I think there's something wrong about the way this has been handled. There's been no serious attempt to explain why we need these amendments, what has to change, and why does it have to change. And then people should be asked to vote not yes or no, but Amendment A, Amendment B, Amendment C, on each amendment.
Right.
That's not happening. So now, does this in any way reflect a desire of Putin to stay on after 2024? I don't think so. As I look at it, I don't see how.
Right.
Maybe later some kind of additional law will be adopted to make it possible. But I don't see that happening. But I really don't like the way it's been handled. And one of the things I am going to do is I'm going to speak out about that. Because, I say, look, if I'm a citizen, then I have a responsibility. This is my country, right? It's my country. So if I don't say anything, then neither should I demand anything. If I refuse to participate, then, then I should just sit on the sofa and shut up.
Right.
All right? So, I always say, if you don't vote, if you're too lazy, or you say, it's not going to help, or whatever, then don't complain. Now, if you're active, then you can speak out. But if you're just going to let things happen, who cares? Then you're responsible. To put it in much harsher terms, I have a grandson who was born in Germany. His father's German. My daughter is not, but they're living in Germany. Anyway, he's now a young man. He's 25. But when he was about 10, I was in Berlin, and I asked him, what do they tell you in school about Hitler and all that, that period? And he said, well, what they tell us is that it's not only Hitler who was to blame, and not only the Nazi Party that was to blame, but it's the German people, because the German people supported them. And I said, whoa, boy, but taking it to what we're talking about, if you don't vote, if you're not active, then who's to blame? It's your fault.
Right.
If you don't like Putin, but you don't vote for anyone else, then what are you complaining about?
Right.
So today in Russia, in my opinion, there is still a very low level of what might be called civic activity, understanding what it means to be a citizen. A citizen. So that's how I'd answer your question.
Good. Well, my next question, I have 12. My next question is number 8, but I think you've already addressed it. It's U.S. Democrats have spent the majority of the Trump presidency alleging that Russia stole the election. And that's become a pretext for reviving Russia as America's bête noire.
Yes.
And asking for your thought. But I think you've already answered that.
I have answered that, yes.
Russia's been building alternatives. The audience for this particular magazine is particularly interested in economics and as well as the politics. Russia's been building alternatives to Western-dominated systems, specifically financial. This includes to protect itself from sanctions involving the U.S. financial system, an alternative to SWIFT, alternative trade deals with other BRICS countries, the Eurasian Economic Union, and also integration with China's Silk Road program.
Yes.
What, in your view, are the implications of this for Russia and the rest of the world, specifically those alternatives and also the United States' impetus to contain, as it were?
Well, I'm not an economist, and so I prefer not to discuss issues that I don't really know very well. But one thing I will tell you, the turning of Russia towards the East, towards China, towards the East in general, is not something that was done voluntarily. It is something that is the result of, first and foremost, the United States making it clear that it would not agree to trade with Russia on an equal basis, would not regard Russia as an equal partner, and in fact would employ sanctions to punish Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So in a certain way, it kind of forced Russia to look the other way. And ultimately, this could lead to some very profound changes in the world situation. Because if you have a trading bloc that consists of Russia, China, India, and the Arab nations, you're really changing the status of the world.
Right.
I'm very hesitant of this because, after all, I do believe in the importance of the similarities of culture, the similarities of religion. Although I'm an atheist, but nonetheless, I fully understand the implications of coming from a Judeo-Christian past heritage, which is very different from what you will find in the East, be it Confucian or Muslim or Buddhism or whatever. I don't think that there can ever really be the kind of deep understanding between, I put it somewhat vaguely, West and East. After all, East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. Right. And in that sense, I think Kipling had an important point. Mm-hmm. So I don't know where this is going to lead to. I'm not particularly fond of that. But again, I place it squarely at the doorstep of the United States. Right. It's a forced move. Because if you're told, well, we're not going to deal with you, then where do I go? I have to deal with someone. Right. So.
But that raises another interesting question. The U.S., Russia is the world's largest buyer and stockpiler of gold.
Yes.
Okay. They saw something coming. And in regards to my just former question, what do you think that is? What do you think they're preparing for? Why are they buying so much gold compared to... Is it just prudent economic sense?
It could. Look, as I said at the beginning when you asked me this question, economy is not my strong point.
Right.
So I find it difficult to answer your question. Yes, it's probably prudence. Yes, it is the understanding that gold is gold no matter what. So that could be one of the reasons.
Okay. Good. Only two more questions.
Fine.
Okay. Russia has increased and improved its relationship, one could say, with China at the expense of the U.S. or because of the U.S.
Yeah.
Economically, militarily,
yes.
Politically. How does this in and of itself affect U.S. hegemony in the world, or Pax Americana? How does that shift, that tidal shift?
I think that the leading factor here is China, not Russia. Mm-hmm. China sees itself historically as the center of the world, and today as the most quickly growing, powerful nation that by the middle of this century will be number one in every possible respect. Mm-hmm. Militarily, economically, you name it. Russia has a much closer relationship with China historically than does the United States. I think Russia has a huge border with China. Mm-hmm. Russia is much more dependent on China than the United States is. And I think that the Russian leadership understands the need to create as many positive relations with China as possible, looking down the road as to what's going to happen. There could have been a U.S.-Russian entente, if you will,
right,
that would have stood in the way of Chinese hegemony. It's not happening. And in the long run, I think what's going to happen is that the big winner is going to be China, and the big losers are going to be Russia and the United States, but perhaps the United States even more than Russia, because the Russians are doing a lot to improve relations with China, working with the Chinese, whereas the United States is continuously opposing China economically and so on and so forth. The Chinese have a very long memory, and they're not forgetting who's doing what.
Right.
I would say that what the United States is doing is very short-sighted vis-a-vis China.
Right. Good. We come to my final question.
Yes, sir.
And this is, I hope, one that is near and dear to your heart. In your talks, in your lectures, over the last several decades, one of the main themes that you return to time and again is your desire to see better understanding. It's your purpose to see that.
That's correct.
Between Russia and the United States.
Right.
Considering, I have several parts to this question, but I'll give you all of them. Considering the tensions that have arisen in the past 6 years, is there actually any path towards better understanding? And if so, what are your ideas on how this could occur? How could it be accomplished? What bright ideas or mechanisms either exist or could be created? And indeed, as an example of that, would there be any interest in renewing or reviving that which you were a pioneer of, the space bridges, and a direct communication between U.S. and Russian citizens going, who are you? This is who I am. Who are you? Etc. Or perhaps a direct TV series exchange. I mean, what are your ideas, and do you think it's possible at all? And if so, how do you think it could be done?
I think it's possible. But it's hard to imagine that happening in the short term. Because for that to happen, there has to be an understanding on both sides that this is necessary and that this is in the interests, in the national interests of both countries. Mm-hmm. Without that understanding, it's very, very difficult to achieve anything. Should that understanding, whoever, say, a new president or something, that kind of thing occurs, then there are ways to make this happen and to make the attitudes change as rapidly as they made them change the other way. One of the grand ideas, of course, is, for instance, on a yearly basis, to exchange, say, 10,000 kids between the ages of 9 and 12 to live for a year in the homes of each other and to go to the schools of each other, just for 1 year, mm-hmm. and then go back home. That in itself would play a stupendous role in changing outlooks or even informing outlooks. And if you did that for 10 years, you'd have 100,000 of those. And those would people who would occupy important posts in the future. Certainly things like space bridges are quite possible. Again, today I know for a fact that the Russians are open to it. The Americans are not. Channel 1, I proposed this. They said, if the Americans are willing to, we'll do it. ABC, NBC, CBS, nobody's interested. This contact, this face-to-face contact, is extremely important in changing attitudes. We saw that happen back then, back in 1985. Mm-hmm. It could happen again. But the basic underlying thing is an understanding on the part of both sides that this is something we need. It's good for us. It's good for others too, but we're not talking about others.
Mainly us.
We're egoists.
Right.
It's good for us. Let's do this.
Right.
And what I'm waiting for, and I don't know whether I'll ever, whether I'll live long enough for this to happen, is for the leadership on both sides to come to this conclusion. It doesn't mean we're going to fall in love with each other. It doesn't mean we're going to be close friends. It means we're going to have what one might call normal relations.
Right.
We'll have our differences, but we won't have the prejudice, the fear, and sometimes the hatred that we harbor. And therefore the danger, once again, of being misunderstood and of firing off a few missiles the atomic clock, clock will no longer be at 2 minutes to midnight,
right,
but maybe at 15 minutes to midnight. And that's basically a huge triumph. So that's how I would see it.
Well, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Reg. I just have one final personal. During one of your lectures, you spoke about a Spanish poet.
Yes.
During the Spanish Civil War.
Yes.
And a story attached to that.
No, it wasn't a poet.
It was a writer.
I spoke about a man by the name of Jorge Semprún, who
right.
fought during the Spanish Civil War and retreated into France after Franco won. And then when the Germans invaded France, he was in the resistance. He fought the Germans, and he became a very well-known guerrilla fighter. And finally, he was captured by the Germans, and then he was held in a Gestapo solitary confinement place, and then sent off to one of the German labor camps. But he lived. And later he wrote a book called The Long Voyage about that trip to the labor camp, 5 days in the train. And in that book, there's a part where he writes about his being in solitary confinement, and the German guard who was standing there asked him, "What's your crime? Why are you here?" And he says, "I'm here because I'm a free man." And the guard says, "Come on, what do you mean you're a free man? You're in jail. I'm free. I'm going to go back to the, and then I'll go have a beer or something. You're not free." And Semprún says to him, "You don't understand." He said, "When you invaded this country, everything you brought with you was against freedom. As a free man, I had no choice. I mean, I could have sat at home, read my newspaper, drank my wine, and not risk my life. But in that case, I was giving up my freedom. As a free man, I had no choice. I had to fight you. And that's why I'm here. You're not a free man. They tell you to do this, do that, shoot me, whatever you do it. You don't understand. I'm free and you're not." That's the story I like to tell.
It's a great goddamn story.
Isn't it?
It's a beautiful story.
Yeah.
Yeah, my father was a political commissar in that war. Moreover, my godfather was Milt Wolff.
Oh, wow.
Who was the last commanding officer of the brigade.
That's right.
And it's really interesting that most people don't know this. Hemingway idolized Milt Wolff.
I know he did.
When he came out of the Battle of Jarama.
Yes.
He made a real, this is as noble a fighter as Lincoln, blah, 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 blah. Milt Wolff tolerated Hemingway, appreciated the first drink of scotch that Hemingway bought for him, because Wolff was a kid, as my father was, and never had scotch before. But he basically said, let the writers romanticize war or whatever. I'd much rather read about it than have to do it. And went on to say, if I have to do it, I don't look at myself.
I understand that.
Romantically.
Right.
It's a job, and you do the job.
That's right.
But that was my godfather.
Right.
And he was a hell of a... And the interesting thing is he left that, went to work with a British intelligence special executive to get arms into the partisan countries, then went to Burma and got recruited out of Burma by Wild Bill Donovan.
For the OSS?
For the OSS. And what's incredible is that you tell this story to kids nowadays,
they don't know what
and they go, "What do you mean?"
They don't know what
I'm saying that a premature anti-fascist, translation, communist, was in the formation of the CIA. Do you get the irony, the absurdity? The God is laughing if he exists?
Yes, he certainly is.
On that particular point, more than anything else. And he went off in the OSS, and he led the partisans in Italy, killing Nazis.
Of course.
So when people go, like, why are you so radical, Mark? I go, well, I grew up in a family that liked to kill two kinds of particular vermin.
Right.
If you remember Kill Bill.
Of course.
And we were talking huge. A, fascists.
Right.
B, Nazis. And to my death, I consider that one of the highest virtues of being a citizen anywhere.
Of course.
As anybody rightly should.
That's right.
And it was I wanted to tell you that story because I thought
Thank you.
you'd appreciate it.
I would, indeed.
In retrospect.
Okay.
Great.